Good morning, Melanie.
Hello.
Hello. Spring has sprung. All of a sudden, we went from this up, well, who knows? It may continue. This crazy up and down weather, snow, freezing cold, 80 degrees, back and forth. But everything pretty much is bursting out.
Yeah.
All the leaves in the woods, all the flowering shrubs, the black flies.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Do you remember? I remember when Allegheny County was cooler, zone 4. We didn't have many mosquitoes, at least I didn't up on my hill. No ticks to speak of.
Oh.
And we haven't got the chiggers yet that we used to have in Kentucky when I lived down there. The black flies did move down about 20 years ago.
Okay.
As someone told me, as we got cleaner waters in our lakes and streams, the black flies came down from, say, the Adirondacks in Canada and whatnot. So anyway, I just am reminiscing how, yes, on the one hand, you had a short growing season, but it was much more fun to be out garden.
Right. Didn't have all the pests.
And so hot.
Yeah.
And muggy.
And I can imagine that mosquitoes are related to weather and the warming of the weather, but are ticks as well?
I would assume so.
Okay. Because I don't remember ticks being
a problem.
This bad.
Well, also we didn't have Lyme disease 20, 30 years ago, or we weren't aware of it if we did. So, yep, gardeners, you have more of Mother Nature
Christian is
on the wild side to contend with than we used to, it seems like to me. And I, who do not like hot, humid weather, I'm already moaning and groaning about have you stepped outside after that rain shower?
Yeah.
It's like going into a sauna.
I love it.
You love it.
Yeah. Ask me again in July, though. Okay. Hi, Christian.
Oh, Christian, hi.
Hi, good morning. How are you?
Well, we're just gabbing about or complaining about the weather, but we're going to get started here.
I'm enjoying the weather.
She likes
I like it hot.
No, I don't like it hot. For me,
Me too. I like hot.
Yeah, well, you come from more hot, unless you came from up in the mountains.
No.
For me, the perfect outdoor working weather would be 40 to 45, sunny, with maybe a 5-mile-an-hour breeze. Starts getting above 50, and the layers start coming off. Okay, our topic today is twofold. Finally, sowing some of your seeds. Now, I'm going to focus on some vegetable seeds, but this would apply for your flowers as well. And transplanting some of your tender plants, assuming we're not going to have a crazy dip in the weather again, but we might. That's why you save your cardboard boxes, but we'll get to that later in the program. I wanted to start off, by the way, there are several people that tune in after the fact, Christian. I didn't know if you knew that. We have 4 or 5 people that tune in and watch the program afterwards. So I want to say to them, I'm sure you have questions on the topic. Just email them to
the library, alfred@stls.org.
Okay, you want to say that again slowly so I can never.
alfred@stls.org.
Alrighty. And then we will have the emails in 2 weeks, and I can look at them and then answer your questions right off before we start our new program. That way we can kind of get the people who are just listening more involved, perhaps. Alrighty, so that was number 1. And number 2 is finally time to sow your seeds outdoors. However, you're already a month late for those early crops that enjoy cool weather. My peas are already this high up. My spinach is this high up. My transplanted lettuce is big enough to have a big salad tonight. What else? My green onions that I started from seed indoor are now about this high. They're still skinny. Laura's Brussels sprouts and my broccoli transplants, they're all chugging along. We had an almost disaster, about a week or so ago. Once again, the temperature dropped. And I scurried around covering things up with old blankets, old sheets, towels, boxes. So everything came through that big chill for one night. Now, as we know, those kind of crazy up and down temperatures, 25 to 80, all within 24, 48 hours, still might happen. So I'm going to suggest, once again, save some boxes, some old towels, listen to the weather report. Don't wait till 9 o'clock at night. Do it at 5 or so in the afternoon if you work, when you come home from work, to protect those still. We're going to talk about our tender tomatoes now, later in the hour. But the other night, I was a little concerned about my potatoes because they are half hardy, but I wasn't sure if it was going to go down below 30. So I had already mulched my potatoes with a couple inches of leaves. So even though it's time consuming and annoying, I went out and just fluffed the leaves up over they were about this high up, nice little dark green rosettes of potatoes. And they're fine. The next morning I had to go and brush the leaves off, but that was just enough cover to keep them okay.
Yeah. One of our questions is, how do you protect new plants from things like hail? Would you
Oh,
use cardboard boxes in that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Or I've lived here now, almost 40 years. And yes, we have had hail, but never what you hear about on the news, which seems to be more in Tornado Alley,
Yeah.
where they can get hail as big as ping pong balls. The biggest hail I've ever seen is pea-sized or smaller. So even a towel draped over whatever would protect it.
Okay.
Or cardboard box. If it was, say your tomato plant was this high, a nice box would do just fine.
Okay.
Now, if you're going to have hail, you're going to have wind. So you might have to put a stake or two to hold the box from blowing away.
Okay.
Okay. All right. You want to hold on the rest of the questions till we,
sprinkle them in when we
sprinkle them in. All right. Interrupt. And Christian, if you have a question, just if I don't see you waving your hand, just holler, okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Now we're in almost about the third week in May. So it's time, I think, even though some of my more conservative, cautious gardener friends still wait, not you, somebody else, waits till the middle of June.
Oh, wow.
He's ultra conservative, but I'm not. I'm willing to take a bit of a risk. And with our new climate, the average, I keep saying this, nobody believes me. The average last frost is the 10th of May, which was about 10 days ago.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't mean we won't get a frost afterwards, but it's a 50-50. And the further you get from the 10th of May, the less likely it is to happen. So and we have moved from zone 4, our famous zone 4, up to the cooler part of zone 5A, which means on the average in the winter or overall, we're about 5 degrees warmer, Christian, than we used to be 10, 20, 30 years ago. And 5 degrees is a lot. I think the glaciers started coming down with less of a change in the opposite direction many, many years ago. So we shouldn't be saying, oh, it's only 5 degrees. 5 degrees is serious. All righty, so corn and beans. Now, I'm sorry, guys. You should have prepared. We're not going to go over it again because it should have been done in October. And next October, at the end of this program, we will talk in detail about getting your garden ready for the springtime. But assuming you've done that, we're going to start from there. And we're going to start with the green beans. I always do 2 things before I plant my green bean seeds in the ground. One is I soak them for 2 to 3 days in room temperature water to kind of trick them into softening up so they will sprout more quickly in a cooler soil. Because by planting them, usually I plant them in the middle of May. The season got away from me. So usually they would have been in the ground 10 days ago. When the soil is still cool, and bean seeds do not like cold soil or wet cold soil in particular, and they're likely to rot on you rather than sprout and grow. So here's how I do it. And because I'm particular with my garden map and where I plant my different varieties, and because my memory is not as good as it used to be, I always either make a note. These are my progressive green beans. These are my yellow Cherokee yellow beans, and put the note with the little bowl of water with the bean seeds. If you have several varieties and you think, I'll remember which is which, maybe you will. Maybe you won't, and maybe it doesn't matter. So anyway, on day one in the morning, I just put enough, they're going, like when you make your baked beans, they're going to swell. So maybe 4 times the amount of water. If you have a 1/4 cup of dry beans, you want a cup of water in a big enough bowl so it doesn't run over when they swell up, and just let it sit there for 24 hours in the water. Drain it off the next morning. And then for the second day and maybe the third day, maybe 2 or 3 times a day, rinse it, but drain it so they just stay damp. By the third day, you should begin to see, unless they're dead seeds, a little white sprout coming out. I think that's the root part rather than the leaf part. But anyway, ideally, you want to get them planted that day, because if that little white, let's call it the root, gets a little too long, then it's going to be a bit fragile. And when you plant it, you don't want to break it off. So maybe the first time you do this, 2 days, plant it at the end of the second day. But before you plant it, especially if you have a new garden, one of the wonderful, Christian, quiz time. What's the wonderful thing about beans and peas that are legumes? What are they able to do that other plants can't do?
Nitrogen. On the,
Nitrogen, yes.
the cycle of the nitrogen. Yeah.
Right. What we're breathing is almost 80% nitrogen, N2, but the plants can't use it that way. They need it converted into a nitrate or a nitrite. And the bacteria that live in the soil and on the root hairs of legumes like peas and beans do that for us. They convert, remember your soil is 1/4 air, which means it's 80% of that 1/4, whatever that is nitrogen, N2. And it's those little bacteria that we can't even see that convert it into plant food and make legumes wonderful for farmers ever since we began farming to grow, because they keep the soil fertile rather than depleting it all the time like corn does. You can buy it in a little package. It looks like a black powder. It's been mixed with something to whatever. And it's called an inoculant, a nitrogen fixing bacteria inoculant. And I really don't know. I've had my package in the fridge for years. And I mean years, maybe 10. Still seems to work unless my original application 30 some years ago has now infiltrated the soil. And so my soil has these bacteria if it didn't in the past. But anyway, since I still have some, and you do not have to dump the whole package. A pinch will do just fine. And when you add it is just, maybe 2, 3, 4 hours before you're going to plant late in the day. Unless it's pouring rain. Listen to the weather report before you do this 2-3 day sequence, because you want your second or third day not raining so you can go out and plant. Where was I going with this? Oh, let the seeds be damp, but not sopping wet. And then when you sprinkle your pinch and mix it up with a spoon or your finger, that black dust will go pretty much on all of them. Won't hurt you. When you're done planting, you can wash your hands off because they'll be black, like you were playing in the soot in the fireplace, right? So that's getting ready to plant your green beans. Or if you grow dry beans like I do, or lima beans, same thing. Same thing with your peas, which you put in a month ago, right? Right. All righty. Beans. Because I have good garden soil, my rows are only 18 inches wide. That's about that wide. And remember, they're raised up a few inches from the paths.
Mhm.
So I have good drainage. No, and it's okay. Well, yeah, if you want to give me some water. Then I take my hoe and I just make about a 1-inch deep trench in my nice, loose, friable soil. And now, if you bought new seeds from a reputable nursery or a good catalog that has a good reputation, then I would simply plant your beans anywhere from 3 to 4 inches apart in the row. Because I have good deep soil, I put them 3 inches apart. So for every foot, there'll be 4 bean plants. So however long your row is, and remember, they're very productive. So unless you have freezer space or want to can, why you would want to can green beans, I don't know. You don't need 20 feet of green beans at one time. You might want to plant 5-foot sections every 2 weeks or so. Figure out your variety. Is it 60 days, 2 months, and they die with the frost? So you want them to start producing middle of September, back up. The last bunch would be the middle of July, and they'd be ready by the middle of September. And if we didn't have an early frost, or if you didn't cover them up with grandma's blanket, you can harvest them all before the last frost. So that's all that fun and games, 8th grade math. They go in 1 inch deep. And if it's new seed, I would just put one in every 3 or 4 inches because most of them will sprout. If you have old seed and you haven't tested it, but you're thinking, well, then double the amount every 1.5 inches or every 2 inches. Then if half of them come up, you're fine. If they all come up, you've wasted some seed, thin them out, be heartless, put them in the compost heap, the green part of the compost heap, right? All righty. Then very gently with your hoe, cover them up that 1 inch, and very gently, especially if they're starting to sprout their little white root, very gently with the hoe press down, not hard, just a little bit. Then at that point, I leave them be because they like a warm soil. And even now, although it's, for me, hot out there, it's going to be supposedly 80 by this afternoon. We'll see. The beans love it. And that dark soil is going to soak up the infrared heat from the sun and warm up. So let it go for about, I'm thinking 2, maybe 3 weeks. Now, you're going to have some weeds grow in that time. So at the end of that 2 or 3 week period, depending, you can very shallowly hoe the weeds out, break them out of the way, or right close to the little bean plant, which will be about that high by then, by hand. Then put on your 2 inches of mulch, whatever that is. For me, it's the old leaf pile. Or yeah, I have a lot of leaves, so that's what I use, but there's lots of different kinds of mulch you can use. This then will do 3 things. Quiz time? Poor Melanie.
Sure.
Okay, why do we put the mulch down now in the middle of June?
No idea. I fail. I get an F.
No, you don't fail. And I'm sorry, Melanie helps me out with this. She's the only one here, so I pick on her. Christian, why do we mulch at this time? See if you can do better.
Or sorry, the temperature, well, I'm still learning here because about times.
Yes.
'Cause down there in Colombia, it's
Winter.
sorry, it's like any time of the
All
year.
right. Okay.
It's the same temperature always.
So why would you mulch?
Well, to avoid the weeds around the plant.
Most of your garden weeds, not all, but most, need light to germinate.
Mm.
If you cover them up with a 2 inches mulch, it's dark. They don't know what to do, so they don't grow. So that's the main reason. Also, if all of a sudden it gets a dry spell or a drought, if you have a mulch on the surface of the soil, it reduces the evaporation of the water. But there's another, they don't mention this. There are certain diseases, usually fungal or bacterial, that live in the soil, and when it rains and the raindrops splash up and make your spinach muddy, that causes the disease to start on the leaves of your plants. So the mulch keeps the mud splatter from happening, so you have less of those kind of diseases. And if you're mulching your lettuce and your spinach, which I usually do, the leaves, you hardly have to wash them at all because they'll be relatively clean. Although I once had a daughter that said, "Those bugs walk around on my lettuce. I don't want to eat it." Anyway, what can you do? All righty, green beans. Let's see, we've planted them 1 inch deep, 3 to 4 inches apart in a row about 18 inches. If your soil isn't that deep or rich or wonderful, maybe make it 2 feet. Give them a little more soil to work with. So double if the seeds are old. And bean seeds, I'm trying to think. I tend to, because they breed true, especially I grow 2 types of dry beans. One is called black turtle and one is called Mexican red, which were grown before old Columbus showed up. And so they're quite an old variety, and I love them. They're dry beans. Where was I going with this? I don't remember. Oh, well. Staking. Oh, maybe that was it. Most green bean varieties or wax beans are now relatively short, maybe 2 feet high and sturdy. And so, especially if you have plenty of sunshine, they'll be sturdy. Beans don't like to grow in the shade. Don't bother. So I don't stake those beans, but my dry beans tend to grow 3 feet high or so. So, and since I have a woods, I have a lot of brush that I keep trimmed. I just stick the brush in every 3 inches or so, and the brush is about 3 feet high. And that takes care of keeping the dry beans up in the air and off the ground. Otherwise they would sprawl. All righty. End of the beans. Any questions on beans before we move on to the corn? Okay. Now, the beans are pollinated pretty much by the bees. Oh, saving the seeds. That's what I was on. I save my green bean seeds and my dry bean seeds because they will breed true. And I don't know all the science behind that, but they're pollinated by the bees. And so there's not a lot of cross-pollination going on. So I can grow my Mexican red next to my black turtle. And when I grow my own black turtle seeds, they come up black turtle. They don't get mixed up. So that's, but corn is a different story. It's pollinated by the wind, which is why in all the books you read, you never plant one long row of corn. You plant it in blocks because the wind, unless you want to go out there with a hand fan or, do this like you're some servant to the pharaoh with the fan, you need the wind to blow through your corn field or little block of corn to get the wind to pollinate the tassels. So what I always did in my small garden when I grew corn, I'm looking at these tables. 5 feet long, are they? Sure. Okay. I did a block 4 feet by 4 feet, and I did 3 blocks down the row of my garden. So there were 4 feet wide, and each block was 4 feet long. And then what I did was I had 3 rows in that 4 feet at 16 inches apart. 16 times 3 is 48, which is 4 feet. So you had 3 rows of corn in there. And in the row, I planted them 8 inches apart. So I wound up with, let me look here before I, and you know what I mean by staggering the row? If the outside row was here and here and here, the middle row would be in the middle of that, staggered. And then the third row would match the first row. That way, each corn seed would have the maximum amount of soil that it could function in without too much crowding of its neighbors. So I wound up with 17 stalks of corn in that block. And nowadays they've bred the corn, almost all the varieties have 2 ears. So you wound up with 34 ears of corn. So what I did was 3 blocks. It was just me at this point eating the corn, besides the raccoons, which we will get to. I chose 3 varieties that took about 2 weeks apart to mature. So the first was an early corn, usually a yellow one, and it would be starting after 60 days, 2 months. The next one, which for me was one of those butter and sugar, the yellow and the white kind, that took more like 72 to 76 days. And then the last one was, what was that? Silver Queen, an old heirloom that grows 9 feet high and makes really long white ears of corn. But that took close to 3 months. However, if I planted them all in the middle of May, let me just double check here. The first one, by the middle of July, I'd start having corn. And it would last about the 2 weeks because both ears wouldn't get ready right away. And sometimes, even though the varieties have been bred to be pretty much the same, there's some variety. So maybe the corn stalk on the outside or on the south side would get ready to eat 2-3 days before the ones up on the north end or in the middle. So usually that block would take about 2 weeks for me to eat through, which I could do, you know, like one a day or whatever it would be. And then in early August, that second one would start in and it would last through maybe 2-3 weeks into August. And finally, that Silver Queen would come in at the end of August and run into middle of September or so. Now you could probably squeeze in 4 blocks, a little tighter, and find, you know, a little closer time to maturity. And then you could eat corn from early July through early October. So that's what I did in the old days. Now another variety is called, I don't know, you probably from Colombia, are you aware of the 3 sisters, or what do you call it? The Native American tradition of planting the corn with a squash or a pumpkin and the pole beans. Christian, have you heard of that in Colombia, or don't they do that there?
Yeah, the 3, we call it the 3 straits. So it's like the tallest one, the corn, with some squash with the beans to help same time the nitrogen absorption on the soil, and then another one. So we have like a tall plant, a medium one, and a short one, a small one.
Okay, that's dealing with height. I must admit, in my first 4 years of college, I was a chemistry math major, and I did enjoy the math. I drive my friends nuts because I'm always doing things mathematically. So I actually, if you wanted to do this, you would need probably a 4-foot diameter about a yay, of good soil, a hill, slightly mounded. And then from the center, a 3-foot diameter, in other words, what would that be? 1.5 feet out from the middle, the circumference, you would plant 12 corn seeds.
Mm.
And when you planted the 12 corn seeds in the middle of May, in the middle of that circle, you would transplant out what you started indoors or in your cold frame, 3 weeks old, so it's not very big at that point. Maybe it has 4 leaves at 3 weeks. Your pumpkin or your winter squash. And then you would wait maybe 2 weeks, end of May. Now the corn's about yay high. Then at the edge of the circle, maybe only in 4 places, traditionally the 4 cardinal points, north, south, east, west, or if you have really rich soil and sturdy corn that you're growing, maybe you could do 8 seeds of a pole bean. Now, some pole beans only grow 6 feet high, and some are like Jack's beanstalk. They'll keep going. Your corn varies also from 6 feet to 9 feet or 10 feet. So match the variety of pole bean with the corn you're growing, because otherwise the poor corn might get overtopped by the bean that wants to keep going. And then the idea was the corn acted as support for the beans, which provided the extra nitrogen for the corn, the greedy corn, and the squash in the middle would spread out as a ground cover. And according to Chester Galley, who's no longer with us, but was one of our original master gardeners, he was sure that if he planted lots of pumpkins and squash in his corn patch, the raccoons wouldn't walk on the prickly leaves to get to his corn. I don't believe that, but Chester did. So anyway, and the trick is trying to time everything so none of the 3 are out of control. If the beans get going too soon, they'll topple the corn. All right. Or if the corn gets going too fast or early, it'll shade out the pumpkin. So it's a bit of fiddling around and learning through a couple of years of experience if you want to try this. All righty. A couple of problems we have with corn. I don't know when it was. I'm going to say 20 years ago. The geneticists started fooling around with the sugar content, because anybody that's old enough to remember, anybody who was a gardener and grew corn or read books about it, it always said, at 4:30, send the kids out to the garden to pick and shuck the corn. Mom, meanwhile, puts on the big pot to boil the water. And as soon as the kids come in with the corn goes in the pot and then they eat it. Because in the old days, peas and corn in particular are only sweet, freshly picked. As soon as they're pulled from their stalk or the vine, the sugar begins to convert to starch. Who wants to eat a starchy corn cob on the cob, right? Well, geneticists and the public, I go to the grocery store, God knows where the corn came from. They put it on, what was that movie? From Here to Eternity, I think, about Dean something or other, that young actor, the farmer out in California, and trying to get the fresh crops to the east with the refrigerated trains. So anyway, the corn gets picked wherever, puts on the truck, bounce, sits in the supermarket, who knows how long, and then you buy it. Well, forget it. Why would anybody buy corn in the old days unless it grew in your backyard? Well, now they've fiddled with the genetic codes, and they call it SE, sugar enhanced, or SSE, double sugar enhanced. There are 3 or 4 varieties now. But the trouble with that is, this goes back to having babies and blue eyes and brown eyes. Because it's wind pollinated, it cross pollinates.
Mm.
And what you are eating is not the leaves, which would not be affected, but the seeds.
Mm.
So if you're planting some sugar enhanced only in your garden, and your neighbor right over the fence has some old fashioned bantam, say,
Mm.
they're going to cross pollinate,
Mm.
and you're going to lose your sweet corn. And unfortunately, the wind, to half a mile.
Mhm.
So people who actually grow these for the trade, they have to be in certain parts of the country where there's some strict rules about who can grow what, because they need that half-mile barrier at least to ensure, unless they want to grow it in a closed greenhouse
Mm.
or under, some kind of system where the pollen's pretty fine, can't get through.
Mhm.
So that can be a problem. Be aware of when you eat your beautiful enhanced sweet corn. Why isn't it sweet, Mom? Well, it's because the neighbor was growing something else. So that's one problem. Wait a second here. Doo-ba-doo-ba-doo-ba-doo. Where's my problems? Okay. Oh. The second real problem are the raccoons. They love your sweet corn about 3 days before it's ready for you to eat. And they seem to know. I have a feeling that they have a scout in the tribe, and it's his or her job starting about 2 weeks before the corn is ready for you to harvest. They send them out every night to check things out.
Mhm.
And when it's 3 days, I swear to God, 3 days before, decimation.
Mm.
And for a few years, I grew corn. And then the raccoons found my house out in the country and my garden, I guess. And for 4 years, I tried various schemes.
Mm.
They win every year.
Mm.
So if you are determined and you have problems with coons, there are 2 solutions. One is a thorough, strong, heavy-duty metal fence, not chicken wire, but stronger than that. And it needs a roof. The screening has to go over the top because they can climb,
Mhm.
and it has to go down into the ground a foot or 2 because they can tunnel. That's a lot of work.
Mhm.
Or it's possible there are certain breeds of dogs that are bred to be and easily trained. You set them loose at night in your garden and they're trained. They stay in your yard. All they do is chase off the deer and the raccoons if they don't get into a fight with the coon, and keep your corn safe. But both of those cost a lot of money, take a lot of time. And so my solution is I gave up and I buy my corn. I don't grow corn anymore because we're lucky here. There are some very good local sources of corn that you can get. It's picked that morning, you buy it that day, and it's pretty good. And you don't have to worry about catching the raccoons in a have-a-heart trap and drowning them in the pond. So, or the deer, I haven't resorted to shooting deer yet, so there's no way to keep them out. So that's what I've done. I've given up with my corn. Unfortunately. Let me see here. Sowing. Oh, okay. Any questions on this before we move on to transplants? And what time is it, Melanie?
12:09.
Okay, we have 20 minutes. That's fine. Christian, any questions so far about this?
No, I was just wondering about when you were talking about the design with the corn, the pumpkin. If is this related to the permaculture, the design?
Now I don't know a lot about permaculture, but to me that means dealing with perennials and trees, like nut trees and raspberry bushes, things that will, once you plant them, are there for years and years and years, permanent. These are not permanent. These are just a one
Yeah.
season thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The only permanent, and maybe we can talk about this some other time. I do have asparagus, which are 25 years permanent, and raspberries, which should be 10, 15, 20 years permanent. And blueberry bushes. Someday I'll tell you the sad tale of my cherry tree, but not today.
We
Yes.
do have a question about birds. So if you put seeds out to plant, how do you keep birds out of them?
I'll tell you a wonderful tale. I don't know if my friend Hope is listening, but many years ago, when we were all younger, she lived for a while in Missouri, back in the heyday of the hippies, the 60s, 70s, whenever it was. And she bought a farm down somewhere in Missouri. And a lot of crows there. And crows do have a reputation. It's like, once again, they have scouts and someone's sitting in the tree and they say, caw, caw, she's playing the corn. And then they're not interested in the corn, the green, but as soon as somehow they've learned and they pass it on to their kids, once the corn sprouts, they'll go into your garden, pluck up the corn, and at that point, it doesn't have much in the way of roots, and they eat the corn seed. Is that what you think they were talking about?
I think any sort of seeds.
Well, that's the one I've heard of
Okay.
the most. Well, according to Hope, she planted her corn, sat down at the edge of the garden, and had a conversation with the crows. And they didn't pull up her corn. To me, that was just a fluke. Whatever. You see, I don't have any problem with, I've never heard really of problems with birds.
Okay.
If anything, the birds, and we'll have a whole session on birds later on in the year, they're your friends. Whatever you can do to bring the birds in, especially in the spring, birds tend to be either seed eaters or bug eaters. But in the spring, when they're feeding their babies, they all tend to be bug eaters. Oh, and berry eaters. So whatever you can do to bring them in, they will help keep your garden free of bugs. I do remember, this just a quick aside, one year the phoebes nested right in behind my house. Now there is a 15-foot wide band between the house and the tall Norway spruce. When those phoebes set up shop, a week to build the nest, 2 weeks to sit on the eggs, 2 weeks to feed the babies, and another week to hang out, there was not a flying bug in that, what did I say, 15 feet wide and 80 feet long stretch. They just kept the air clear of anything that flew. Okay, we got to move on. Any other questions about beans or corn? All right, transplanting. It's also, now, even though the broccoli, your early lettuce, and your early onions starts went out around the middle to the third week in April, depending on the year. Now it's time for the tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, yellow squash, pumpkins to go out. I would hold off on the lima beans and the watermelons and the butternut squash. The reason being, Kristen, you may know this, I did a study once on those three main families of pumpkins and squash, and they all originated in different places. One in Mexico in the lowlands, one in South America, relatively lowlands, but one in the higher elevations. And depending on where they originated from millions of years ago, some are more sensitive to frost than others. So I have discovered my maximum pumpkins are more hardy than my butternut squash, and I don't know how to pronounce it, moscata, something like that. And they were the ones that evolved in the lowlands,
Mm.
the winter squash. And I'm assuming watermelons, I don't know where they came from, but same kind of thing. So your lima beans, your watermelon, and your butternut squash are the things I grow, most sensitive to temperature. So I wait till June 1st.
Mm.
But my pie pumpkins, jack-o'-lanterns, butternut, zucchini and yellow squashes, they're now a good 4 or 5, even 5 weeks old
Mm.
in my sour cream cups, perfect
Mhm.
size. And they have about 4 to 6 leaves on them. And they're ready to go out with a box sitting next to them.
Mm.
So if it looks like it's going to get down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, I go out at 5 o'clock and put the box on. Maybe have to put a stone on top of the box if it's going to be windy, so it doesn't blow away, or just an old towel draped over them, whatever. But all of those things can go out. But I want to focus on, what do we have, about 10 minutes?
About 15.
15, oh good. Tomatoes, there's a few tricks of the trade for tomatoes. Now, I do start my tomatoes early, around the middle of March. So now they're a good 9 weeks old. I started them out in a regular little cup about the size of this.
Hmm.
No hole in the bottom, Kristen. Terrible, terrible. You just don't overwater them and they don't die. Just be careful. And probably they happily grew and I have a fluorescent light, about 4 weeks, maybe 5 at the most. Their roots have filled up that little cup. Then I have what I call my sour cream cartons. They're more like this high and maybe that round,
Mhm.
twice the volume of this, I'm guessing. I have time on my hands. So I transplant them into the bigger cup after about 4 weeks, maybe 5. And they're still inside, although I do have 2 nice cold frames. And so once the weather starts getting nice in April, I start putting them out in the daytime in the cold frame, because they like the real light better than they like the fluorescent lights. And then with my tomatoes, once again, after about 3, 4 more weeks, maybe 2 weeks before I'm finally going to put them out, I get a bigger pot and do it again. So by the time they go out at 9 or 10 weeks old, they've been sown, transplanted twice. Now they're ready to go out in the garden. And if my pot's this big, they're about this high above the pot.
Mm.
And they've got several layers of leaves.
Mhm. What's the advantage to doing it that way rather than just planting it in that final, starting it in that?
I don't have the room for all those big pots in
okay.
the house under the
Okay.
light. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If I had a greenhouse, I would. It would save
Right.
me time,
Right.
but it would take up space.
Right.
Well, good question, though.
You're not doing it to like make them hardier.
No,
or-
just I want to get for my tomatoes, I would like to get them really big.
Mhm.
So when I put them out in the middle of May, I'll have my tomatoes sooner.
Mhm.
That's all. Okay. Tomatoes are one of those interesting plants that if you pluck off the bottom leaves and only leave maybe the 4, 6 leaves at the top, and instead of planting it this way, you plant it sideways.
Mm.
Here's why. All of us who grew up in the country here have friends who own farm ponds.
Mhm.
But the old joke in Allegheny County back in the day when we were zone 4 was, what do you guys do in the summertime around here? The college students would ask. And we would jokingly say, oh, well, on the 4th of July, we'd go swimming. Because truthfully, it was so cool here in the old days. It really wasn't fun to go swimming. It never was warm enough to go swimming. So if you had a farm pond and you wanted to go swimming, what you did was you floated in the top 6 inches of the pond water, which was somewhat warm. by August.
Mhm.
But as soon as you let your feet drop down 5 feet, the water got pretty cold.
Mhm.
The same with your soil. If you had a soil thermometer and stuck it in your soil, 1 inch, 2, 3, the deeper you went, the colder the soil would be. Tomatoes do not like cold soil. So 2 things to do with your tomatoes. Say you're only going to grow 1 tomato, which is what I used to do for years. Let me think. Around the middle of March, the end of March, if I had mulched that part of the garden, I would rake the mulch off, exposing the soil to the sun. And I would get some clear plastic and lay it down over maybe 3 square feet for a month or 2, whatever. That is going to warm up your soil faster. Of course, clear is going to let the weeds grow, but that's okay. They're going to grow and die, or you're going to weed them off before you plant your tomatoes. So come the middle of May, if you've solarized your soil for at least 1 month, it's going to be a lot warmer.
Mm.
And then what I do is about a day or 2 before I'm going to put the tomato out, if my pot with the roots is this tall, and then I have a stem that's about that tall, I'm going to dig a trench about 6 inches deep and about 6 inches wide, put the dirt to the side, and then I'm going to, with hot water, sorry worms, going to pour a watering can of hot water in that trench and let it soak down, warm up the soil even more. And then in a day or 2, I'm going to take my tomato plant out, get it out of its pot, trim up those extra leaves, lay it sideways in the trench, and then very carefully fill it in so that the stem is supported
Mhm.
all the way up to the neck,
Mm.
which is going to be lying on the soil. Cover it up. And just like with your beans, you don't want to mulch it for 2 or 3 weeks. Plants are smart. You do this late in the day. I also have 2 things. I have some milk crates, which I tend to eat, unless the plant has been well hardened off and is used to being out all day in the sun and the wind. I put a crate over it for the first week during the day to slow down the breeze and reduce the amount of sunshine. But if it's well hardened off, you don't need to do that. But I happen to have 2 clear plastic boxes and other cardboard that I have sitting handy for 45-degree nights.
Mhm.
But by the next morning, that little plant that you've buried sideways, it knows which way is up
Mhm.
and which way is down. And so at that point, it's hopefully, it rained the night you planted it. That'd be nice. It would just settle the soil in, extra water. Then you keep an eye on it, because sometimes my plants, because they're 10 weeks old, they're beginning to blossom already. And I don't want them to they can't make tomatoes at this point. That's like having your 8-year-old daughter have a baby. Too young, all right? So you take off the yellow flowers, and you do some weeding if necessary. I just wait my 3 weeks, and then I weed it, and I mulch it once again with about 2 inches. Meanwhile, as soon as that head, the top of the plant has gone upright, I put my stake in the ground. Don't let me forget pinching. At this point, I want to mention 2 things. There are 2 kinds of tomatoes you can buy. One is called Determinate, which I always grew, or Indeterminate. Think Jack's beanstalk again. An indeterminate tomato will keep on growing up and up and up and up until a hard frost kills it, which means you need a tall stake, 6-8 feet high. Sometimes you see in the magazines when they're advertising a certain variety of tomato, the guy is up on a 20-foot step ladder somewhere in the South picking tomatoes. Well, but we did have one. I think it was Jetstar or Sweet Million, something like that. My daughter grew a cherry tomato, which I had never grown, and it was a indeterminate. And we started with a 5-foot stake. And by August, I needed to add another 2 feet. And finally, I just reached up and snipped off the top
Mhm.
because it was getting out of hand. Good solid stake down in the ground, 2 feet. Because if a tomato plant grows 6, 7 feet, it's going to be big. Now, there's different theories of thought. Some say trim that tomato plant to one stem, which you tie at about 6-inch intervals to your stake. And pinch the suckers. And what are the suckers? The main stem and then the branch. And after a little while, between the branch and the main stem, a set of leaves will start to grow. We want to make tomatoes, not extra leaves. We need enough leaves to provide enough shade to keep tomatoes from getting sunburned. But those extra leaves with your fingers, just pinch them out, add them to the mulch. I let sometimes 2, maybe 3 grow. Now the determinate tomato plants, I don't know if that was something the geneticists bred or they were just out there in nature. They only grow to a certain height, usually 4 feet, 5 feet. And then the tomatoes all seem to set at once. And within a month, you have your crop. Now, for us in the north with the short season, even now, that was always pretty good because in the old days, you used to start getting tomatoes late in July, but the frost usually came in the middle of September. So you didn't have that long a growing season for tomatoes. So most of us grew determinate tomatoes, which meant a 5-foot stake. And you got your tomatoes all within a 2-month period. But these indeterminate ones, if you can get them out there early, you can have your tomatoes by the 4th of July, and they'll keep you making tomatoes. Last year, we didn't have a killing frost till the middle of October. So Laura's tomato was headed for the sky. And we finally, in the middle of September there, just before the hard freeze, picked the last of them. And once again, cold air sinks. So if you have something growing right along the ground, and it's one of those 29, 33 degree nights, the tomato that's 6 feet up in the air probably will survive because it'll be above the frost line. Whereas anything down laying on the ground will get zapped. So that was what, July, August, September, 3.5 months. Almost a good 15 weeks of tomatoes from one plant. So I think, the only other thing I do is, and these are kind of like old-fashioned ideas, but based on science. I say starting in February or so, I save my eggshells. And I have a wood stove, so I just set them on the trivet on the wood stove and dry them out really dry. They begin to get brown. And then they crush right up in your hand, in tiny pieces. And when they're dry, I save them in a jar. Tomato like calcium, and I think blossom end rot, which is caused by irregular watering, Mother Nature or you, can cause it. And then the end of the tomato, it kind of rots where it had, where the flower was, where it connected to the stem, either because of the lack of calcium, irregular watering, or the absence of magnesium. So the old guys would say, put in a tablespoon or so of Epsom salt. Remember, didn't you used to soak your feet in Epsom salt somehow, something like that? I don't know why. Anyway, I don't do the Epsom salt, but I do save my eggshells. And so when I dug that trench for the tomatoes, and this is true for peppers too, they like the calcium, sweet or hot peppers, I sprinkled, I don't know, a handful of squished up eggshells in the bottom of the trench. I hesitate to put them on the top of the ground because even though they were dried, I have a feeling they might attract raccoons or possums or who knows?
Other critters.
Yeah, other critters, maybe. Let me just think. I think that's it on my tomatoes.
We have one more question from someone. She wanted to know if you can grow broccoli, Robbie,
Rob, yeah, Rob,
R-A-B-E.
I think it's Rob. but,
broccoli, Rob, in pots on your porch.
yes, if the pot's big enough,
Okay.
I would say at least 12 inches, preferably 18-inch deep pot, and a good, preferably 18-inch wide pot per plant. Now, the thing about broccoli, some varieties are better than others, but they'll all do it, I believe. Once again, broccoli is a cool season crop. So you start it like my tomatoes. I start my broccoli in the middle of March indoors. And by the middle of April to the third week in April, I put it out with some possible protection. Then by late June, if you grow the early varieties, 60 days, because just like peas and corn taste best fresh picked because of the sugar content, broccoli tastes best when it matures in the cool weather, which we have a real problem now. It never used to be a problem in Allegheny County. June used to be a perfect month for these crops. It would be in the upper 60s during the day and down to 50 at night. And now that doesn't happen anymore. The sooner you can harvest that first head of broccoli, whether it's a 6-inch mini or another 2 weeks in a, I don't know, a 12-inch bigger one, if you can get them harvested by the end of June, but even then we get these, I mean, we've already had an 80-degree weather in what? In April, right? Or was it late March? Crazy. And that's just, it's just not going to be a sweet, wonderful tasting broccoli when it starts, either as a spinach or the lettuce. Then if you leave your broccoli, it sends up side shoots and you have these little heads, which you, once again, with a, you know, the stem might be 2 inches long. And if you don't have a problem with those little green worms from the little white butterfly from Europe, as my grandson said when he was 6, one day in May, he came in and said, "You're right, Grandma." And I said, "Yeah, about what?" And he said, "You just put the broccoli out and I just saw those white moths flying around." He called them moths, but they were those white cabbage butterflies from Europe. And they make the little green inchworm. If you can keep them under control, then you can probably keep your broccoli growing all summer long for another month or two by taking off those babies. Now, the other broccoli rab, I'm not sure what that is. Who asked? Was it Rima?
Nope.
No, somebody?
Patron, yeah.
Okay. They'll have to look that up online. Off the
Okay.
top of my head, it's in the same family, but it might just be greens rather than heads.
It looked like greens when I looked it up. Yeah.
Yep. Once again, broccoli, and if you pronounce it rabe, I don't know. They could probably do with some late afternoon shade. And they don't like it hot, so I wouldn't sit them on the concrete driveway or the blacktop driveway. I'd find a grass
Cooler.
or something cooler, or dapple shade if it's later in the summer. Any kind of greens. They don't like the hot summer. You know, we usually think of our salad greens, although they've been breeding them more and more not to bolt, go to seed with the long days in June and the hot weather. But if you want to grow spinach or lettuce or this, I would grow it in dapple shade or on the east side of your house where it has morning sun, but afternoon shade, and keep it well watered.
Okay.
All right. More questions before we run out of time, which we might have. Now, I have never had trouble with bugs with my tomatoes. We do have those little green inchworms with the broccoli. And once again, be sure when the kids aren't looking to get, in the salt water with the broccoli, or if you cook it in boiling water, you always miss one. And there's a little white dead worm in your broccoli. Don't let the kids see it, because if they see it, they won't want to eat that either. Just from experience. Any questions, Christian? Or comments?
No, I just remember about the determined and indeterminate tomatoes,
Yes.
that when I was working on the greenhouse in Fillmore, they have the indeterminate, and they just grow the whole year, and
Yes.
it can be just 20 feet long,
Yeah,
and they keep growing, growing,
Yep.
growing.
pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing. Okay, next time, if I remember correctly, we're going to talk about the gardener's favorite thing to do, weeding. Because by early June, we're going to have to start dealing with the weeds. There was an old saying, and it is true. 1 year's seeding, 7 years of weeding. So you want to catch those the weeds before they go to seed. And then we're going to talk as well. Now it's the time to start mulching in your garden, and maybe talk a little bit about staking. What kind of, if you have a small space, Mary Harris once did a fun talk on the vertical garden. And so if we can get as much up off the ground going up, we have more space on the ground to grow things. So that, and let's see, do we have any time at all today?
No, we
No.
are over.
Okay, we'll talk about the rhubarb then next time.
And that's it.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.